know what to do. I just came home to work from this. And she just left my baby thing.
Okay, ma'am, I'm gonna get EMS and I'm gonna get police and fire.
This is so serious. I'm so scared. I don't want to get locked up because I was at work.
Okay, ma'am. I understand that you're scared. I completely
tell me like I don't want to get locked up because this is not my fault. I had just came home from work. My babies was stuck in the stove dead, and I just came home from work. My cousin was babysitting my kids and left my kids dead in my house.
Nothing is permanent in this wicked world, not even our troubles. But Lamora Williams will be permanent in prison and even 35 years into her afterlife. There are stages of wickedness, and this one beats our imagination, topping the list of whatever you think you know. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Lamora Williams sat on the edge of her couch, her fingers trembling as she stared at the oven across the room. Its stainless steel surface gleamed under the dim kitchen light, but it was no longer just an appliance. It was a weapon. Her chest tightened as she rose, her legs moving as if guided by some unseen force. She approached the oven, her breath quickening, her heart pounding. The children were asleep in the next room. Jakarta, just 1 year old, and Chianti, 2. Their soft breathing was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the oven door. For a moment she saw their tiny hands, their innocent smiles, but the darkness crept back in, drowning out her conscience. She opened the oven door. The heat hit her face as she lifted Jakarta, his small body limp in her arms. He stirred slightly, but didn't wake. She placed him inside, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. The oven door closed with a soft click. And then she turned it on. An hour later, she did it again. Chianti was next. By the time the authorities arrived, it was too late. The house reeked of burnt flesh, a scent that would haunt investigators for years. Lamora sat on the couch, her face blank, her eyes empty. She didn't resist, didn't speak. She just sat there. A shell of the woman she once was. A mother of 3 in Atlanta, Georgia, has been sentenced to life in prison without parole for killing 2 of her sons by placing them in an oven and turning it on. Lamora Williams, 24, was convicted of the deaths of Jameel Penn, 1, and Chianti Penn, 2, who were killed roughly an hour apart. Ms. Williams knowingly and intentionally placed her 2 little children in the oven and turned it on. Stay tuned and don't move an inch. Why? Because you've never heard of anything like this, and it's nothing like any form of abuse you've ever known. You need to know what happened because you should never jump to conclusions without knowing the full story. So, let's go on a ride. This is not just a crime. This is a descent into madness. And it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about evil. Stay tuned. You won't believe what happens next. Welcome to Detective Jeffrey Crime Station. A huge thank you to our amazing subscribers and viewers for joining us on this journey into the world of true crime. We're honored that you've chosen to spend your time with us, and we're grateful for your trust and support. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell to stay up to date on our latest captivating stories. Your engagement means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more thrilling and thought-provoking content with you. In the quiet neighborhoods of Atlanta, Georgia, a tragedy was unfolding that would soon shock the community to its core. It was October 2017, and 24-year-old Lamora Williams, a mother of 3 young children, was struggling with demons that few could see or understand. What drove a mother to commit such an unthinkable act? How could a woman tasked with protecting her innocent children become their executioner? Lamora's childhood had been marked by instability. Born to Brenda Williams in the early 1990s, she grew up in an environment where financial struggles were a constant companion. The family moved frequently between apartments in Atlanta's more affordable neighborhoods, never quite establishing the roots that might have provided stability. Was this constant shifting of homes and schools a factor in Lamora's developing psyche? Did the groundwork for future troubles begin in these formative years of uncertainty? As a child, Lamora had exhibited concerning behaviors that prompted her mother to seek help. She struggled in school, not just academically, but socially. Teachers noted her tendency to withdraw, to exist at the periphery of classroom activities. By her teenage years, these struggles had intensified. Mood swings became more pronounced, her behavior more erratic. There were visits to counselors, prescriptions written, appointments missed. The mental health system, underfunded and overwhelmed, proved inadequate to address the deepening issues that Lamora faced. How many opportunities for intervention slipped away during these critical years? What difference might proper treatment have made? The autumn air had turned crisp in Atlanta as leaves began to fall from the trees lining the streets of the apartment complex where Lamora Williams lived with her children. Behind the walls of her modest apartment, life had become increasingly difficult for the young mother. She was raising her children largely alone, working when she could, and battling inner turmoil that seemed to grow with each passing day. Did anyone notice the storm brewing behind her eyes? Could anyone have predicted the horror that was about to unfold? Lamora's journey to motherhood had begun earlier than she might have planned. Her first pregnancy came during her late teens, a time when many of her peers were thinking about college or careers. Instead, Lamora found herself navigating the overwhelming responsibilities of parenthood while still developing her own identity. The father of her child provided sporadic support, both financially and emotionally, leaving Lamora to shoulder much of the burden alone. Was this early thrust into adult responsibilities more than her fragile mental state could bear? Did the weight of young motherhood accelerate her psychological decline? As the years passed, Lamora's family grew. She gave birth to Kayant in 2015, followed by Jakarta in 2016. 3 children under the age of 5 now depended on her for everything: food, shelter, emotional nurturing, guidance. The walls of her small apartment seemed to close in with each passing day. The crying of infants, the demands of toddlers, the constant needs that required attention wore away at her reserves of patience and stability. But she even had her big ones, and death occurred. The walls of her small apartment seemed to close in, wore away at her reserves of patience and stability. The occasional help from family members provided brief respites, but never enough to truly allow Lamora to recover her equilibrium. Sleep deprivation became her constant companion, further eroding her ability to think clearly, to separate reasonable thoughts from destructive ones. How many nights did she lie awake, listening to the sounds of her children breathing, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing down upon her? How many moments did she spend imagining an escape from the life that had become her prison? Lamora's story began long before that fateful day in October. According to her mother Brenda, Lamora had battled mental health issues since childhood. She's had issues from a baby, her sister Tabitha Hollingsworth would later tell reporters, her voice heavy with the weight of hindsight. Issues my mom tried to address with the state of Georgia. Had the system failed this troubled young woman? Were there warning signs that went unheeded? Those who knew Lamora described a woman who oscillated between periods of normalcy and troubling behavior. Friends recalled how she would sometimes appear overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood, especially as a single parent with limited resources. The father of her children, Jameel Penn, was present in their lives, but did not live with them. The challenges of raising 3 young children on her own weighed heavily on Lamora's shoulders. Was she crying out for help in ways that went unnoticed? Did the pressure of parenthood push her already fragile mind to the breaking point? On that October day in 2017, the unimaginable happened. The morning began like any other in the Williams household. The children likely woke early, as young children do, needing attention, food, and care. But something was different about their mother that day. Something had shifted in Lamora's mind, something dark and irreversible. What thoughts raced through her head as she made the decision that would forever alter so many lives? Lamora placed her 2 youngest sons, 1-year-old Jameel Penn and 2-year-old Keontae Penn, inside an oven. These innocent children, with their whole lives ahead of them, became victims of an incomprehensible act of violence. She turned the oven on. The boys were subjected to what medical examiners would later describe as prolonged exposure to heat. How long did those children suffer? What sounds echoed through the apartment as the unthinkable crime took place? Their older sibling, thankfully, was spared this terrible fate. The apartment must have fallen silent afterward. Did Lamora pace the floors, contemplating what she had done? Did she immediately realize the gravity of her actions, or was her mind too fractured to process the reality of what had occurred? Hours passed as the terrible truth remained confined within those apartment walls. After the deed was done, Lamora made a video call to Jameel Penn, the father of her children. Perhaps this was her way of confronting the horror she had created, or maybe it was a desperate cry for someone else to intervene in a situation she couldn't handle. What he saw through that small screen would haunt him forever. It was like a real horror movie. It was Friday the 13th, Penn recounted, his words carrying the trauma of that moment. When I saw my kid, how I saw my kid, that's when I knew what was going on. The images that flashed across Penn's phone screen were beyond anything a father should ever have to witness. His young sons, lifeless, bearing the horrific evidence of their suffering. How does a parent process such a sight? What words could possibly capture the anguish that tore through him in that moment? Immediately after witnessing the horrific scene, Penn called the police. After I seen what I seen, you know I called the police, he said. The memory's still raw. His voice likely shook as he tried to explain to the dispatcher what he had just witnessed through a video call. Did he hope, against all reason, that there was some mistake? That his children might somehow still be alive? Around the same time, Lamora herself called 911, but her story was different. When I came in, the stove was laying on my youngest son's head, and my other son was laid out on the floor with his brains laid out on the floor, she told the 911 operator, her voice perhaps calculated in its desperation. Was she attempting to craft a narrative that might absolve her of responsibility, or was this the confused explanation of a mind that could not process its own actions? I don't know what to do. I just came home from work, Lamora continued, her words creating a fictional timeline that investigators would later dismantle. Can you please help me? She pleaded with the operator. Can you please tell me, I don't want to get locked up because this is not my fault. I had just came home from work. The desperation in her voice was evident, but was it genuine concern for her children or fear of the consequences she now faced? She claimed she had left her children with a caregiver who was now nowhere to be found. I had left my 3 children with a caregiver while I went to work, she insisted, constructing an alibi that would soon crumble under scrutiny. Was this a desperate attempt to escape responsibility, or the confused ramblings of a mind untethered from reality? Police officers who responded to the scene found the 2 boys with burn marks. The apartment was likely filled with the lingering evidence of what had transpired, a tipped-over oven, the unmistakable signs of a tragedy that could not be undone. How did those first responders process what they encountered? What thoughts went through their minds as they secured the scene and began their investigation? But the medical examiner's findings painted an even more disturbing picture. These weren't simple burns. They were thermal changes that appeared to be entirely from dry heat and changes from prolonged exposure to heat. The autopsy report stated chillingly that it would require an extensive amount of time to get to this degree. The clinical language of the medical report belied the horror of what it described. Had the boy's suffering been extended, deliberate? Was there any moment when Lamora might have reconsidered her actions and stopped the unfolding tragedy? The autopsies revealed that the children's heads had likely been placed inside the tipped-over oven. Such specific positioning could not have been accidental. What darkness must have consumed Lamora to commit such a calculated act? What profound break from reality could explain such behavior from a mother toward her own children? Despite her initial claims of innocence, investigators quickly determined that Lamora's story didn't add up. There had been no caregiver. The children had not been left with anyone else that day. The tragedy was far more direct. According to the arrest warrant, she had knowingly and intentionally killed her children by placing them in an oven and turning it on. The deliberate nature of the act, as described in legal documents, sent shockwaves through the community. How could anyone reconcile the natural protective instinct of motherhood with such a horrific act of violence? News of the murders spread quickly through Atlanta and beyond. Neighbors gathered near the apartment complex, many bringing flowers, teddy bears, and candles to create an impromptu memorial for the young victims. Some stood in silence, unable to comprehend what had happened so close to their own homes. Others embraced, sharing in collective grief for children they had never met, but whose deaths touched them deeply. How does a community process such a tragedy? What words of comfort can possibly suffice when confronted with such inexplicable violence? In the aftermath, Lamora's mother revealed the extent of her daughter's mental health struggles. She told reporters she had just visited her daughter in jail and had warned authorities. "I also let them know to put her on suicide watch because she's gonna kill herself." The anguish of a mother facing the reality that her daughter had killed her own children was palpable in her words. Was this a mother's intuition about her troubled daughter, or an attempt to frame Lamora's actions through the lens of mental illness? Brenda Williams spoke of her daughter's long-standing mental health issues with the weariness of someone who had fought a losing battle for years. Had she tried to get help for Lamora? Were there moments when intervention might have changed the course of events? The weight of what-ifs must have been crushing for the grandmother, now grieving the loss of her grandchildren at the hands of her own daughter. Tabitha Hollingsworth, Lamora's sister, spoke with the weight of tragic foresight. "This was something we saw that could possibly happen," she said, her words heavy with regret. Such a statement raises profound questions about the weeks and months leading up to the tragedy. What warning signs had the family observed? What attempts had been made to intervene? Had the family been crying out for help that never came? Were these deaths, as Hollingsworth claimed, preventable? The children's father, Jameel Penn, was left to grapple with an unimaginable loss. The grief of losing two sons so young would be devastating under any circumstances, but the manner of their deaths added layers of horror and disbelief to his mourning. How does a father move forward after such a trauma? What words could he possibly find to explain to his surviving child what had happened to their siblings? In the days that followed the arrests, more details emerged about Lamora's life. Friends and acquaintances painted a picture of a young woman who had become increasingly isolated. Some reported that she had seemed overwhelmed by her responsibilities as a mother. Others mentioned concerning behaviors that, in retrospect, might have signaled her deteriorating mental state. Had opportunities for intervention been missed? Could more support have prevented this tragedy? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel as a means of encouraging us. Thank you as you do so. As the investigation continued, authorities pieced together a timeline of events that contradicted Lamora's initial story. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements created a clearer picture of what had actually transpired on that terrible day. The evidence pointed to a deliberate act, not a tragic accident or the work of an absent caregiver. How did Lamora react as her fabricated story unraveled? Did she continue to maintain her innocence even as the evidence mounted against her? In 2018, Lamora Williams was indicted on 4 counts of murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of concealing death, and a false statement charge. The legal process moved forward with the methodical pace of the justice system, while the community continued to mourn the loss of 2 innocent lives cut tragically short. Throughout the legal proceedings, she maintained her innocence, but the evidence told a different story. The courtroom became the stage for the final act of this tragedy. Prosecutor after prosecutor presented the evidence against Lamora Williams. Medical experts detailed their findings from the autopsies in clinical terms that nonetheless painted a horrific picture of how the children had died. Police officers recounted what they had found at the scene. The 911 calls were played, allowing the jury to hear Lamora's own words as she reported the deaths of her children. Did any of the evidence cause Lamora to show emotion? Did she remain stoic throughout, or did the weight of her actions finally become apparent to her? Lamora's defense team likely focused on her mental health history, arguing that she was not in her right mind when the killings occurred. Expert witnesses may have testified about her psychological state, perhaps suggesting that she suffered from a severe mental illness that impaired her judgment and understanding of her actions. Was there any way to explain such a heinous act that could generate even a modicum of understanding or compassion from the jury? The case finally reached its conclusion on Friday, November 15, years after those 2 young lives were extinguished. Lamora Williams was convicted of multiple charges, including murder, aggravated assault, cruelty to children, and other related offenses. The courtroom likely fell silent as the verdict was read. Did Lamora show any reaction? Did the realization of spending the rest of her life behind bars finally break through whatever barriers she had constructed in her mind? The judge handed down the ultimate punishment available under the law: life in prison. The sentence reflected the severity of the crimes and the community's demand for justice. But could any punishment truly fit such a crime? Would this sentence bring closure to the grieving father? Could justice ever truly be served for Jakarta and Jameel Penn? As Lamora was led from the courtroom for the last time, she left behind questions that may never be fully answered. What had gone so terribly wrong in her mind that she could commit such violence against her own children? Was this the result of mental illness left untreated for too long? Or was there something more sinister at work in her actions? The tragedy reverberated beyond the immediate family, touching on larger societal issues. Mental health advocates pointed to the case as an example of the devastating consequences that can result when serious mental illness goes untreated. Child welfare experts questioned whether existing systems had failed to protect vulnerable children from a parent who posed a danger to them. What changes might prevent similar tragedies in the future? How many other families were silently struggling with similar issues, teetering on the edge of disaster? The small memorials for Jakarta and Chianti eventually weathered and were cleared away. The news cycle moved on to other stories, but for those closest to the tragedy, there would never be true closure. Jameel Penn faced the challenge of raising his surviving child while carrying the weight of immeasurable loss. How does one explain such a tragedy to a child who lost their siblings in such a horrific way? What words could possibly ease such pain? Brenda Williams and Tabitha Hollingsworth were left in the impossible position of grieving their grandchildren and nephews, while also grappling with the knowledge that their daughter and sister was responsible for their deaths. The complex emotions of such a situation are nearly impossible to fathom. How does a family reconcile love for a daughter with horror at her actions? Is forgiveness even possible in the face of such a crime? As Lamora Williams began her life sentence, the community was left to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How could a mother commit such an unthinkable act against her own children? What failures in the mental health system might have contributed to this tragedy? And what becomes of a family shattered by such incomprehensible violence? The story of Lamora Williams and her sons stands as a dark testament to the depths of human tragedy, a reminder of lives cut short and a family forever altered by one woman's unfathomable actions on that October day in 2017. Behind the sensational headlines and court proceedings were two innocent children whose potential would never be realized, a father left to piece together a life shattered by loss, and a woman whose actions defied understanding even as they demanded accountability. In the years that followed, Jakarta and Chianti would have grown from toddlers to young boys. They would have started school, made friends, developed interests and talents unique to each of them. Instead, they remained forever frozen in time, remembered in photographs, in the hearts of those who loved them, and in the stark details of a case that shocked a nation. Could any sense ever be made of such senseless loss? Would the pain ever truly fade for those left behind? The tragedy of Lamora Williams serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of the human mind, the devastating consequences when mental health crises go unaddressed, and the innocent lives that can be lost in the process. It raises uncomfortable questions about our systems of support for struggling parents, about the recognition and treatment of serious mental illness, and about the protection of vulnerable children who depend entirely on the adults in their lives. As Lamora Williams began serving her life sentence, locked away from society in a prison cell that would become her permanent home, the echoes of her actions continue to reverberate through countless lives. The judicial process had run its course, but the ripples of tragedy would continue to spread outward, touching lives far removed from that apartment in Atlanta where two young boys met their end at the hands of the woman who should have protected them above all others. We hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. Because you did, subscribe to our channel and hit the like button to show your appreciation. Additionally, tap the notification bell to be kept abreast with our latest videos and ensure you don't miss out on any new content. This will keep you informed about our upcoming true crime stories and allow you to stay engaged with our community. Thank you once again. Your support means a lot to us.